In this section, we are going to talk about how to choose the right ITX case and motherboard for the Sakura and Snow 3060T graphics card. This card is a compact and powerful GPU that features a pink PCB and a white cooler. It is perfect for building a cute and powerful ITX PC. The first thing you need to consider when choosing an ITX case and motherboard is the size of the card. The Sakura and Snow 3060T has a length of 170 mm, a width of 112 mm, and a height of 40 mm. This means that it can fit into most ITX cases that support dual-slot GPUs. However, you should also check the clearance for the power connectors, which are located on the side of the card. The second thing you need to consider is the airflow and cooling of the case and the card. The Sakura and Snow 3060T has a single fan that blows air through a dense heatsink. This means that it can get quite hot under load, especially if there is not enough ventilation in the case. Therefore, you should look for an ITX case that has good airflow and enough fan mounts to keep the card cool. The third thing you need to consider is the aesthetics and features of the case and the motherboard. The Sakura and Snow 3060T has a unique pink and white color scheme that can match well with other pink or white components. You can also add some RGB lighting to make it more colorful and attractive. Therefore, you should look for an ITX case that has a tempered glass side panel to show off your build, and a motherboard that has RGB headers and other useful features. To help you with your choice, we have selected some of the best ITX cases and motherboards that are compatible with the Sakura and Snow 3060T graphics card. These are based on our research from various sources. Cooler Master Masterbox MB520 ATX Mid-Tower Case. This case has a sleek black design with a mesh front panel for optimal airflow. It can fit up to 4 120mm fans or 2 140mm fans in the front, 1 120mm fan in the rear, and 2 120mm fans on the top. It also has a tempered glass side panel, 2 USB 3.0 ports, and an audio jack on the front panel. Corsair ICUE 220T Mid-Tower Case. This case has a stylish white design with 3 RGB fans in the front for excellent cooling and lighting. It can fit up to 6 120mm fans or 4 140mm fans in total, with 3 in the front, 2 on the top, and 1 in the rear. It also has a tempered glass side panel, 2 USB 3.0 ports, an audio jack, and an RGB controller on the front panel. Corsair 275, our mid-tower case. This case has a simple white design with a solid front panel for minimal noise. It can fit up to 6 120mm fans or 4 140mm fans in total, with 3 in the front, 2 on the top, and 1 in the rear. It also has a tempered glass side panel, 2 USB 3.0 ports, an audio jack, and a power button on the front panel. AeroCool Silent RGB Mid-Tower Case. This case has a budget-friendly black design with an RGB LED strip on the front for some flair. It can fit up to 5 120mm fans or 3 140mm fans in total, with 3 in the front, 1 on the top, and 1 in the rear. It also has an acrylic side panel, 1 USB 3.0 port, 2 USB 2.0 ports, an audio jack, an SD card reader, and an RGB button on the front panel. Asus ROG Strix B550 iGaming Mini ITX motherboard. This motherboard has a high-end black design with RGB lighting and premium features. It supports AMD Ryzen processors with PCIe 4.0 support, dual M.2 slots with heat sinks, Wi-Fi 6 connectivity, Supreme FX audio codec, Intel Gigabit LAN, USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, HDMI 2.1 port, DisplayPort 1.4 port, and Aura Sync RGB headers. MSI MPG B550 iGaming Edge Wi-Fi Mini ITX motherboard. This motherboard has a mid-range black design with RGB lighting and decent features. It supports AMD Ryzen processors with PCIe 4.0 support, 1M.2 slot with heatsink, Wi-Fi 6 connectivity, Realtek ALC 1200 audio codec, Realtek 2.5G LAN, USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, HDMI 2.1 port, DisplayPort 1.4 port, and Mystic Light RGB headers. Gigabyte B550i Aorus Pro AX Mini ITX motherboard. This motherboard has a low-end black design with no RGB lighting but good features. It supports AMD Ryzen processors with PCIe 4.0 support, 1M.2 slot with heatsink, Wi-Fi 6 connectivity, Realtek ALC 1220VB audio codec, Intel Gigabit LAN, USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, HDMI 2.0 port, DisplayPort 1.4 port, and RGB Fusion headers. These are some of the best ITX cases and motherboards that you can use to build a cute and powerful ITX PC with the Sakura and Snow 3060T graphics card. We hope this guide helps you to make your choice and enjoy your PC building experience. Now that we have our motherboard ready, we can start installing the other components inside the ITX case. The case we are using is the Sakura and Snow 3060T, which has a cute pink and white design and a tempered glass side panel. It also comes with a 650W power supply, so we don't need to buy one separately. The first thing we need to do is to open the case and remove the side panels. To do this, we need to unscrew the 4 screws on the back of the case and slide the panels off. Be careful not to scratch the glass panel or drop it. Next, we need to install the motherboard standoffs in the case. These are small metal screws that raise the motherboard above the metal surface of the case and prevent it from shorting out. The case should have markings on where to install them, but you can also use the motherboard as a guide. Just align it with the back of the case and see where the screw holes match up. Then, use a standoff tool or a pair of pliers to screw them in. Once we have the standoffs in place, we can install the motherboard in the case. We need to align it with the standoffs and the I/O shield on the back of the case. The I/O shield is a metal plate that covers the ports on the motherboard and protects them from dust and damage. It should come with your motherboard or be pre-installed on it. To secure the motherboard in place, we need to use some screws that came with the case or the motherboard. There should be 9 screws in total, 1 for each standoff. We need to tighten them evenly and not too hard, so we don't damage the board or crack it. Now that we have our motherboard installed, we can move on to installing the CPU. The CPU is the brain of our PC, and it determines how fast it can run. We are using an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X processor, which is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU that can handle gaming and multitasking very well. To install the CPU, we need to open the CPU socket on the motherboard. This is a square slot with a metal lever on one side. We need to lift up the lever until it clicks and then gently pull it back. This will expose some pins on the socket that will connect with our CPU. Before we insert our CPU, we need to make sure we align it correctly with the socket. The CPU has a small triangle on one corner that matches with a triangle on the socket. We also need to make sure we don't touch any of the pins on either side, as they are very delicate and can bend easily. Once we have aligned our CPU, we can carefully lower it into the socket and let it drop into place. We don't need to apply any force or pressure, as it should fit snugly. Then, we can close the lever and lock it down. This will secure our CPU in place. The next step is to install a CPU cooler on top of our CPU. The CPU cooler is a device that keeps our CPU from overheating and throttling its performance. It consists of a heatsink that absorbs heat from the CPU and a fan that blows air over it. We are using a low-profile air cooler from Noctua that fits well in our ITX case. It also comes with thermal paste pre-applied on its base, so we don't need to apply any ourselves. Thermal paste is a substance that fills in any gaps between the CPU and the cooler and improves heat transfer. To install our cooler, we need to align it with 4 mounting holes around the CPU socket. Then, we need to use some screws that came with the cooler to attach it to the motherboard. We need to tighten them diagonally and not too hard, so we don't damage anything. The last thing we need to do is to connect the fan cable from the cooler to a fan header on the motherboard. A fan header is a small connector that supplies power and speed control for the fan. It should be labeled as CPU_fan or something similar on the motherboard. Now that we have our CPU and cooler installed, we can move on to installing the RAM. The RAM is the memory of our PC, and it stores data temporarily for fast access. We are using two 8GB sticks of DDR4 RAM from Corsair, which run at 3200 MHz and have RGB lighting. To install the RAM, we need to open the RAM slots on the motherboard. These are long and narrow slots with plastic clips on both ends. We need to push down the clips to unlock them and make some room for our RAM. Before we insert our RAM, we need to make sure we align it correctly with the slot. The RAM has a notch on one side that matches with a notch on the slot. We also need to make sure we insert it in the right slot for dual channel mode. Dual channel mode is a feature that allows the RAM to work faster by using 2 slots at the same time. The motherboard manual should tell us which slots to use, but usually they are color-coded or numbered. Once we have aligned our RAM, we can carefully push it into the slot until it clicks and the clips lock it in place. We need to apply even pressure on both ends and not too hard, so we don't damage the RAM or the slot. We need to repeat the same process for the other stick of RAM and make sure they are installed in the same orientation. Now that we have our RAM installed, we can move on to installing the SSD. The SSD is the storage of our PC, and it holds all our files and programs. We are using a 1 TB NVMe SSD from Samsung, which is very fast and compact. To install the SSD, we need to find the M.2 slot on the motherboard. This is a small slot with a screw on one end. It should be labeled as M.2 or something similar on the motherboard. Before we insert our SSD, we need to remove the screw from the slot and keep it aside. We also need to make sure we align it correctly with the slot. The SSD has a notch on one side that matches with a notch on the slot. Once we have aligned our SSD, we can carefully slide it into the slot at an angle and then push it down flat. Then, we can use the screw that we removed earlier to secure it in place. We don't need to tighten it too hard, just enough to prevent it from moving. The last thing we need to do is to connect the power supply cables to our components. The power supply is a device that converts AC power from the wall outlet into DC power for our PC. It also has various cables that connect to different parts of our PC and provide them with power. Since our case comes with a power supply pre-installed, we don't need to install one ourselves. We just need to find the cables that match our components and plug them in. The first cable we need is the 24-pin ATX cable, which is the main power cable for the motherboard. It has a large connector with 24 pins that plugs into a matching socket on the motherboard. It should be labeled as ATX or something similar on the motherboard. The second cable we need is the 8-pin EPS cable, which is the additional power cable for the CPU. It has a small connector with 8 pins that plugs into a matching socket near the CPU socket. It should be labeled as CPU or something similar on the motherboard. The third cable we need is the 6 plus 2-pin PCIe cable, which is the power cable for the graphics card. It has a small connector with 6 or 8 pins that plugs into a matching socket on the graphics card. It should be labeled as PCIe or something similar on the graphics card. The fourth cable we need is the SATA power cable, which is the power cable for the SSD. It has a thin connector with 15 pins that plugs into a matching socket on the SSD. It should be labeled as SATA or something similar on the SSD. We don't need any other cables for this build, so we can tuck away any unused cables and some empty space in the case, or use some zip ties or Velcro straps to manage them. We have now installed all our components and connected all our cables in our ITX case. We are ready to put back the side panels and test out our PC. Now that we have installed all the other components, it's time to connect the Sakura and Snow 3060T graphics card and test its performance in games and benchmarks. This card is a special edition from a Chinese vendor called Zephyr, and it features a pink PCB and a white and pink cooler with cherry blossom motifs. It's a very cute and compact card that fits perfectly in our ITX case. To connect the card, we need to align it with the PCIe slot on the motherboard and gently push it down until it clicks into place. Then we need to secure it with 2 screws on the back of the case. Next, we need to plug in the 8-pin power connector from the power supply to the card. Make sure the connector is oriented correctly and firmly inserted. Now we can turn on our PC and see if the card is detected by Windows. If everything is working fine, we should see a pink LED light up on the card and the fan start spinning. We can also check the device manager to confirm that the card is recognized by the system. To test the performance of the card, we are going to run some games and benchmarks at 1080p resolution with high settings. The Sakura and Snow 3060T is based on NVIDIA's GA104 GPU with 4,864 CUDA cores and 8 GB of GDDR6X memory. It should deliver excellent performance for most games and applications. First, let's try Cyberpunk 2077, one of the most demanding games on the market. As you can see, we are getting around 60 frames per second on average, with some dips in more crowded areas. The game looks stunning and runs smoothly on our card. Next, let's try Doom Eternal, a fast-paced shooter that requires high frame rates and low latency. As you can see, we are getting over 200 frames per second on average, with no noticeable stuttering or lag. The game is very responsive and fluid on our card. Finally, let's run some synthetic benchmarks to measure the raw performance of our card. We are going to use 3D Mark Time SPI and Unigine superposition. As you can see, we are getting scores of 11,372 and 10,164 respectively, which are very impressive for a compact card like this. As you can see, the Sakura and Snow 3060T is a powerful and adorable graphics card that can handle any game or application you throw at it. It's also very quiet and cool, thanks to its efficient cooler design. It's a perfect choice for anyone who wants to build a cute and powerful ITX PC.